So if you're curious about creating a podcast and also about how it could help boost and grow your business that you've got, then you need to listen to my next guest. His name is Yann Ilunga, and Yann is an Italian-Swiss entrepreneur, but today lives in Helsinki, and he's a podcaster consultant. He's actually a podcaster himself. He's got a number of successful podcasts, and he's a speaker, and he was dubbed by Forbes magazine as a podcasting advocate. He runs a business called 360 Entrepreneur and the Podcast Success Academy membership. And he also has run the world's #1 podcasting digital conference called the Podcast Success Summit. He's been featured in a number of publications, including Forbes, Inc., Podcast Movement, Entrepreneur, and Huffington Post. So we talked about how to get started in podcasting, why it might be suitable for you if you have a business, how to pick your topic, what kind of gear you need, and some tips on how to get it out there, how to market it. So anyway, if you're interested in that topic, I recommend you have a listen. Here's Yann.
This is the Expat Business Hero podcast, and I'm your host, Alex Congdon.
So hi, Yann. Welcome to the show.
Alex, how's it going?
Oh, it's a real pleasure to have you. Where are you now? You're in Helsinki?
Yes, sir, I am. Helsinki, Finland, all the way up north.
Fantastic. Okay, listen, Yann, I know we had that wonderful introduction about you, but there's another thing as well which struck me, and that was that Forbes called you a podcasting advocate, which is quite some recognition of your expertise in this area. Now, a lot of listeners to this show are, expats looking to start or grow a business, and they love the idea of creating a business that enables them to be flexible, location independent, etc. And podcasting is such a huge enabler for that. And you're an amazing example of someone who's achieved this. So I want to dive into that whole subject with you in just a second. But just to get started, I'd just love to hear your story. So what do you do today? How did you get started and why?
Yeah, absolutely. People who know me, they know I'm always fired up and I love chatting podcasting. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun. Now, speaking about my story, trying to give the Reader's Digest version, what I do is I'm a podcasting consultant, and that means that I work with entrepreneurs, coaches, speakers who are interested in starting a podcast. So with some, we work on the strategy, some need help with the technical side of things. But then I also work with people who are podcasters already, and with them we focus more on the marketing side of things, or people who are interested in being on the other side of the mic and being guests. So that's what I do in a nutshell. Now, how did I end up here? Well, that's pretty simple. I'm originally from the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, and I think if somebody has a pretty good ear can tell that I have this funny macaroni accent. And that's because I'm from the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. So not that far from where you are right now, Alex.
Exactly.
And I've been living here in Helsinki at the time we're recording here for almost 7 years. I think in a month and a half, it's going to be 7 years. And I was traveling around Europe after I did my undergraduate for our American friends, or bachelor at university. I spent a year and I traveled for a couple of months around Europe with a very good friend of mine. And when we were in cities or countries that I liked, I would always look what their master's programs had to offer, or graduate programs. I had studied communications, so that's what I was looking for. And Helsinki was one of the options, the University of Helsinki, where I ended up doing my master's. They had a program called Media and Global Communication. I also met my then girlfriend, now fiance. So it was really a win-win. So I moved here, did the master's, then I worked for a couple of years as a journalist for an English language newspaper. And I also started to do things as a freelancer. So I started to build websites and those kind of things. And then I literally stumbled across this thing called podcasts. I was really fascinated by the idea. And Alex, I'm really a person who could have headphones from the moment I wake up until the moment I can go to sleep listening to music, no problem. So also because of that, I was really drawn into the idea of podcasts. And I asked myself, how could I start doing this for myself? And then I realized that I actually had already quite the network, because I'd worked for a couple of years at a jazz festival in Switzerland. And I was like, well, I already know at least some 20 people or so who could be up for doing an interview. And that's where my first show, the Jazz Spotlight, was born. The problem with that, though, is that as I was doing that, as I was still working, I was also learning more and more about entrepreneurship, digital marketing. And I would listen to podcasts, read books, and find so many interesting people. But the problem was that I couldn't interview them because I was hosting a music podcast, and many of them had nothing to do with music. And that's where my second podcast, the 360 Entrepreneur, was born. So it was a podcast that was really about entrepreneurship, about business. And then I realized that, well, more and more people kept ask me podcasting related questions, from how did you get these guests to what microphone do you use and all those kind of things. And I stopped and said to myself, maybe I ought to take a closer look at what I'm doing, because I was working and helping people first as a freelancer. Then I started to really do it full time with digital marketing. And then I said to myself, well, I keep answering questions about podcasting. It may be a good idea to really take a step back, look at everything I'm doing, and see if it's worth pivoting toward podcasting. And that's what I did. And then I decided to launch another podcast, the Podcast Lab, which is all about podcasting.
Wow. So you're 3 podcasts in.
Yeah. I mean, I collaborated with a community of Italian marketers. So it's like 4. And then I was recently in Italy, met to some business partners, and there was talks of another podcast in the books. So let's see.
Well, how did the move to Helsinki, or how does being in Helsinki and coming from Switzerland affect your business? The fact that you're kind of split location-wise, has this been the ideal business to be doing that?
Yeah, my business is a Finnish company. So I started the business a few years ago when I was already in Helsinki. So when I moved here, it wasn't even something I thought of, being kind of doing something on my own. First, I focused on the studying. And as I was studying, I worked as a journalist. And then little by little, I started to do some freelancing work. And that's where I kind of got the taste, if you want, of being your own boss. Because even though you may use some sites that kind of help bring freelancers and, let's say, employers together, you're still your own boss. So it didn't really kind of affect me much, because it's something that I somehow realized I really wanted to do once I had been already living in Helsinki for a couple of years.
Now it can get a bit lonely, can't it, sometimes? Or, you feel the isolation sometimes doing a business like this. How's that been for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the major quote unquote issues. People sometimes don't believe this, because I'm really a people's person, but I'm quite the introvert guy, meaning I don't have any problem in spending time on my own, but it does get lonely. And I think it's important for people to find ways to really keep in touch with the outside world, especially if somebody is doing something online. Perhaps let's say if somebody develops websites, they may be in their home office from morning until evening all the time by themselves. And I think it's important to find ways not to lose touch with the outside world. And that can be something as simple as say, well, let's say a couple of times a week, instead of working from home, I go and work at a coffee shop, or I get a co-working space, or if it's summertime, I go and work at the park. If you feel that you also want to connect with people online, you can think of doing masterminds. I am member of a mastermind. I've been member of 4 masterminds to date, and we have calls at least once a month, all together. And then oftentimes with individual members, we have calls if, for example, let's say somebody has something specific and they would like to bounce ideas off of the other members. We do that as well. So I've found different ways not to be completely isolated, because I am in touch with people on a regular basis, because I work with clients, do consulting, I do interviews as a host, not as much anymore. I used to do quite much more, and as a guest like we're doing now. So I am in touch with people at different degrees, but I think not everybody ends up doing this kind of job where you get to talk to people. Oftentimes, the most interactions are perhaps by email or something like that.
I want to pick up this point about masterminds, because it's a very interesting subject. What is a mastermind? So for those people listening who may not fully understand, what is a mastermind group? Give me your definition. And how do you join one, or how do you become part of one? And how does it help your business?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So, the idea of a mastermind is a group of people. And I've been in, for example, the current one, we are only three. I've been in a mastermind of five or even six people, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea is to have a group of individuals who come together on a regular basis. We did it once a month and discuss something. And there are different variations, but the idea as a solopreneur, especially, is that you get to bounce ideas of other people who may be at different stages of their entrepreneurial journey. Perhaps there are a couple of steps in front of you, and oftentimes they're also in different spaces. With the people I'm masterminding right now, for example, one of us is really focusing on self-publishing and audiobook narration, whereas the other one is focusing more on audio engineering as well as live video. So I think it's quite interesting not to be too homogeneous, because sometimes if there is something about like live video, which I don't consider myself an expert at, I can ask James. And in terms of the format of the mastermind group, I know there are different formats. I know there are groups where each time the members come together, there is one person who is in the hot seat. So the call is kind of revolves around this specific person. We do it in a different ways. We do so that we always decide on a specific topic that can be of use to everybody. So it can be, I don't know, copywriting, it can be sales, it can be automation, it can be productivity. And then we make sure that all of us do have basically are in the spotlight during the call. And we typically have calls that are about an hour and a half, and we are three people. Now, in terms of how to find masterminds, is relatively simple. I mean, to find people who are interested in masterminds is relatively simple. Find the right people is a completely different story. I've seen, for example, in Facebook groups I'm part of, I've seen people simply ask, hey, is somebody interested in having a call? I would like to brainstorm. And that's how they are born. For me, I was thinking about people in my network, and I'm actually the one. Yeah, if I think I'm the one who kind of started all of the different masterminds, and I was in two different masterminds at the same time, because one, we were three people out of Australia and two of us out of Europe. So there wasn't room for Americans because of the time zone differences. Then at the same time, I was with another one. So that one, for me, we had calls in the late morning, early afternoon, my time. Yeah. And then in the evening, I was in one where we were a couple of Europeans and a few Americans.
It just shows how global these things are, aren't they? I mean, with technology now, there's you can tap into knowledge anywhere in the world with these.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's amazing. Great. Well, I'm part of a mastermind, and we do it like the hot seat approach versus your topic approach, mm-hmm. which I think is a great idea as well. Maybe we'll look at that.
Yeah. I mean, we do have a hot seat approach. If somebody has something quote unquote important coming up, let's say if somebody has a product launch coming up, the person asks, hey guys, do you mind if we put more emphasis on my thing? And anyways, you can always learn from other people's projects. So it's not that if the spotlight is on somebody else, it's going to be a useless call for you. There's always something you can pick up and actually apply to whatever it is that you're doing.
Great. All right. So Yann, let's talk about podcasting. Now, maybe, someone is thinking of starting a business. I don't know, maybe it's a coach, a consultant, a mentor, or any other variety. Why should someone setting up a business like that consider starting a podcast? What could it bring to them?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. As I said, my background is in communications. So that's what I studied at both bachelor and master's level, or undergraduate and graduate. And for me, when I think about the question, why podcasting, I always start by addressing it from a communications point of view, meaning you can be a very skilled writer, but it's quite difficult to build a human connection with a reader. It's easier to do that with your voice, like you and I are doing right now. Using audio allows you to use your voice, and that also allows you to have certain traits about yourself and your personality come up. Think of, I said I have a funny macaroni accent, for example. Had this been a written interview, the accent wouldn't have come across, or the sense of humor. Sure, it can come across in textual content, but it's harder than audio content. So that's the first reason. And one may argue, well, Alex, Yann, isn't then video better? Because people not only get to hear me, but they also get to see me. And while that is true, the question I would have for somebody that makes that argument is, when is the last time you watched a video while you were exercising or you were walking the dog or you were driving? And that's where content consumption and retention come into the picture. While it is very difficult, if not impossible, to consume textual or video content while you're exercising or driving or you're at the gym, you can virtually consume audio content 24/7. I mean, if you think about it, you can be walking the dog, jogging, at the gym, you can be cooking, you can be taking a bath if you are careful. So you can basically be in people's ears regardless of what they're doing. And I once got an email from a listener of mine. Now, disclaimer, this is really something exceptional. It's the only email I've gotten like that in years. But a listener of mine told me, I was about to go on a road trip and I was looking for something to listen, and I came across your Jazz Spotlight podcast. I saw a couple of episodes that looked interesting. I started to download them, and you basically were with me on my road trip of over 1,000 miles for 12 hours. So that person basically listened to my content for 12 hours. And that's a higher retention compared to reading, especially if we think about screens, which aren't ideal for the eyesight, or even watching videos. So those are a couple of reasons why I think podcasting is worth exploring. And a couple of additional ones are that the barrier of entry is much lower compared to something like video, for example. Sure, there is some work that goes behind it, but it's not as kind of challenging as getting started with video, if you will. And the same can be said for costs. Podcasting, getting started with podcasting and being a podcaster doesn't require a big investment as for video if one wants to produce high quality video.
So we got this concept then of really making a connection with the audience, regardless of what they're doing.
Right.
Building on that then, how could it help my business if I've got a business or I'm about to launch a business? How can the podcast actually, be integrated into a business that you've got already?
Yeah. So there we go, or we step into the strategy behind the podcast territory. And I think the first thing one of the first questions one should ask oneself is, what do I want to get out of the podcast? And I think the mistake many podcasters make, and you and I, Alex, were talking about this on a different call. Some people get into podcasting because they think it's sexy. They hear success stories of people who have made, millions, and they think, well, I'm just going to follow their footsteps and I'm going to get the same results. And that's not the case. I think that one should really think about how one wants to leverage the podcast as an asset for their business. And I'll make you a practical example. I can take myself as an example, and then I can mention a client of mine. With the 360 Entrepreneur podcast that I mentioned early on, my second podcast, my goal for that show was very simple: leverage it as a networking tool. So while I was focusing on getting somebody on the show, I was always thinking about the future. And it doesn't really come as a surprise, the fact that for the first edition of my virtual summit or digital conference, Podcast Success Summit, out of the 80 speakers we had, I think 60% were people I had interviewed on my podcast. So I was really strategic. I was doing interviews because I knew that I wanted to connect with those people. And in fact, as soon as I was done with an interview, I would ask the person, is it okay if I connect with you on Facebook and LinkedIn so that we're super connected? So I was using that podcast to really build a network of relevant contacts. And in some cases, those contacts or the touch points ended up there. In some other cases, they went further. So I interviewed them for my summit, which was a paid thing, or we did collaborative things. Perhaps we did like a joint webinar or something like that. So it was really fun to basically look beyond the interview. And I think it's a mistake many podcasters make, not look at the interview as the beginning of a possible collaboration. So that's one thing. The other thing is, one, can leverage the podcast as the platform to build authority, to position oneself as an expert. In other words, you may be focusing on creating products or services or whatever you do, and you don't really or aren't always able to share your expertise, what you know, with those who may not be your clients. So, with those who may not be in your proximity. And with a podcast, you can become the go to person because you are sharing relevant information, practical advice on a regular basis. So, a podcast can still very much valuable, even if it's not an interview based podcast. The Podcast Lab, for example, is not an interview based podcast. I do have expert contributions, but I don't do interviews. My goal with that is to really position myself as a go-to person in the podcasting space so that then I can connect the products and services I have, podcasting related products and services, to the podcast episodes.
Now, how about this? So you're a guest today on my podcast. How about the whole idea of not so much starting a podcast, but going around and being a guest on people's podcasts as a way to give yourself exposure?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I said I was going to bring an example. I have a couple of clients who are exactly like that. So a couple of them realize the power of podcasting, but they aren't really interested in learning about hosting and the technical side. And what they do is they go around and be interviewed. For example, one of them specifically had a book coming out. And what she did is we worked together and she basically went on a sort of virtual book tour. So she did a series, I think it was, I don't know, a dozen interviews or something like that. And she asked the hosts, she coordinated with them to have the interviews published the days before the book launch or right at the book launch, or in a couple of cases following the book launch. So there is definitely, if somebody is listening to you and I, Alex, and it's like, this podcasting thing sounds interesting, keep in mind that, yeah, you can be on one side of the mic, on the other side, or even on both, and can benefit from this fantastic medium.
So we've learned then that guests are more than just guests; they're potential partners. The content as well. I mean, this is something that's also fascinating. I know we had a conversation about that before. It's not just the content that happens in 45 minutes. It can be used in many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, I think that so many podcasters who host interview-based shows, they're just focusing on the interview. And as soon as it's done, they say, thanks, bye, and they chase the next guest. And then they realize how much potential they maybe had to spend 30 additional seconds to see if there are ways he or she and the guest can collaborate. And also not sitting on the content itself, meaning if somebody's interested in becoming a contributor, you mentioned Forbes that I had the pleasure to be featured on, Inc., Entrepreneur, other magazines like that, I was featured on because of my content primarily. So they don't really care so much about the person per se. They care about what the person does and what value he or she can provide. So if you have done some fantastic interviews, for example, why not consider adding a little bit of work and turn those into articles? And if you're not interested in having those articles published on popular publications, you can even simply start your own column on a platform like LinkedIn and or medium.com, for example, so that if there is somebody who may not be that interested in learning via audio, they can still get value and your message can still reach more people because you leverage also the written medium. And sometimes you may have people in your network who have no idea what a podcast is. They may have no idea that you are a podcaster. So they start reading your column and at some point they're like, okay, I ought to go and look what is Alex podcast about. And then they start to become listeners of what you do.
That's amazing. I mean, I've actually been approached quite recently by a magazine, an international magazine, to write a column for them, to feature a column for them. So we're looking to use some of the podcast content to do that. So it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had the podcast. That's what I can say. So let's go back to the beginning then. So how would you advise, let's say, the audience to go about starting a podcast? What are the things you need to be thinking about as you start thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that's the key question. And I already said or we touched upon what do you want to get out of the podcast. I think that's the key thing. And it's really important because the more clarity you have on your podcasting goals, the easier then it is or becomes to answer questions like which format should I have? Should I have an interview-based show? Should I be solo? Should I have a little bit of both? Should I do pre-recorded shows? Should I do live shows? And also once you have identified the format and you say, well, I want to interview people. If you want to talk about a specific topic and you have 3 options, how do you go about choosing guest 1 over guest 2 or guest 3? Or the answers to all those are connected to 2 things. One is your podcasting goals, and the other one is your target audience. So I think that it's important to take a moment, and these I know aren't sexy things. I think people, or when it comes to podcasting, they want to know what is the best microphone and blah, blah, blah. But if you are serious about this and you want to do it long term, then those are questions you have to ask yourself. Then the next question, obviously, is about the equipment. And you don't have to spend $1,000 in order to have a professional sounding experience. If I think about my equipment that I have here in front of me, my microphone, the Samsung Q2U, when I bought it was about $100. I have a Behringer Xenix 802 mixer, which costs, I think, $70. And then I have a pop filter and an arm stand. The price of both combined is $20, $30 at the most. And I have an audio interface that costs, I think, $30. So we're talking about what? $300, not even. And the sound is fantastic. So it is pretty simple because there are so many options in terms of microphones. But for me, it's so that a person should remember that they can always change microphones. So they shouldn't let the budget they have available be an excuse for not starting with a podcast. When I started podcasting, I had a different microphone. So you can always upgrade. So once you know what your goals are, you have an idea of what you're going to need. You're going to need a microphone. And we could be here talking about microphones the entire time. But if you want, Alex, I can send you the links to a couple of episodes I did that were all about equipment, because there I talk further about microphones if you want to add them in.
I think that listeners would appreciate that a lot. That we put that in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect.
So let's go back to the topic then. So when you, and again, it's all about, you've got the reason for why you're doing the podcast clear, but then you're trying to match it with your business. Let's say you're, I don't know, you're a trainer. You train people how to do presentation skills, I don't know, something like that, or communication skills. And you decide you want to do a podcast to help grow your business. How important is the topic of the podcast in relation to the business? Should it be exactly aligned or related?
Yeah, I think it depends, because, for example, if you say, well, I want my podcast to be a relationship building asset, then it's okay, even if there is, quote unquote, some distance between the topic and the angle of your podcast and your business. In more practical terms, let's say you're, I don't know, a Facebook advertising agency or solopreneur. So one would think, well, I should do a podcast about Facebook advertising because it's what I do for a living. Well, not really. If you want to connect with people, you may be better off having a show that has a wider scope. Perhaps is social media, perhaps is paid advertising. And sure, sometimes you're going to cover Facebook advertising, but that's may not be the only thing you want to cover. On the other hand, if you really want to leverage your podcast to build authority and really position yourself and connect the products or services you offer to the content, then it makes more sense to have the content of the show be as close as possible to what you do. I mean, if you have an episode that is all about Facebook advertising, it's much easier to plug in your course on Facebook ads. Whereas if you're having a conversation with a guest and you guys are talking about, mentoring, for example, that may be harder. There may be a bigger disconnect between the call to action and whatever it is that you offer and what the conversation has been all about. So I think choosing the topic, or more than the topic, is not all about the topic, but also the angle, really depends on how one wants to go about it. And I mentioned relationship building. I mentioned building authorities. There may be other ideas one may have. So I think it really depends on what one wants to do. And as I said, in some cases, you can even have a hybrid approach. So you can say, for example, sure, I want to build relationships. So I want to interview people, but I also want to do solo episodes. In that case, you can go for it as well. Perhaps you have 2 episodes a week, and one is always about interviews, one is always you solo, or you say every second week you have an interview, so then every other week you have a solo episode. There is no written rule. That's also what is so cool about this, that you can really experiment. I've experimented with so many different approaches, which gives me then a better insight and better scope kind of understanding podcasting. I'm not going to say at 360 degrees because that would be a bit presumptuous thing to say, but a pretty good scope for sure.
So what about marketing? And you touched on this a little bit already, but you've got your podcast, you've got your business now, but you want people to listen to you. You want people to engage with the content. How do you do that? Because it's not, is it just you build it and they come? I don't think so. You have to get it out there, don't you?
Yeah, it would be awesome if that's were the case, but it isn't. And actually, one thing I want to add that I think is important to give people a reality check, going back to your previous question, Alex, before I talk about marketing, is people have to remember that the bar is raising. So even though it is easier to get started with podcasting compared to video, let's say, it's also true that there is more and more professionals that have entered or are entering the podcasting space. I'm thinking of media corporations. I'm thinking of journalists. I'm thinking of celebrities, which means that even if you are an independent podcaster, and I record here in my home office. I've done things by myself, so I don't record in any fancy Hollywood studio or whatever. It's important for you that you really value the content, but also the overall listening experience and if you have guests, you and the guests create. And audio quality definitely fits or becomes part of the conversation. So even though I said that one shouldn't let the gear hold them back from getting started with podcasting, it's also true that if I think, actually, I'll add one additional thing. When I started my first podcast 4 years ago, in the new and noteworthy section of Apple Podcasts, out of 10 podcasts, there was maybe only one that was by a professional, a media company like the New York Times or something like that. Nowadays, it's almost the opposite. Out of 10 podcasts in that section of iTunes or Apple Podcasts, there's maybe 2 that are by independent podcasters like you and I, and the rest are by professionals, which is quite telling. So it's important to think about that. Now, in terms of the marketing, personally, I think that it's about a couple of things. The first is about understanding who your target listener is and go where they are. And the second thing is also to realize that depending on who that target listener is, depending on your topic, you have to keep in mind that you may want to target people who not only aren't listening to your podcast, but who don't even know what podcasting is about. So there you have to have an educational component as well when you're marketing your podcast. In my case, for example, when I promote the Jazz Spotlight, which is tailored to independent musicians and people in the music business, I can't expect most people to know what a podcast is. On the other hand, if I promote the Podcast Lab, which is all about podcasters and is tailored to people who are either interested in podcasting or are podcasters already, teaching people how to explain what a podcast is, how to find and subscribe to one, for example, isn't something as relevant. So I think it's important to think about who you want to target, where they're spending time. Is it online or offline? If it's online, where? Is it a Facebook group? Is it specific Facebook groups? Is it on Instagram? Is it publications that you are reading? Are those people reading them as well? If that's the case, then you want to get in front of them. And it's not about screaming, hey, listen to my podcast, listen to my podcast. It's about becoming part of the conversation that is already ongoing, or become the spark that starts the conversation. Sometimes it's one end, or it's one instance, sometimes is the other one, and sometimes is kind of both. So on a place like Twitter, for example, which is really dynamic, with some people, you're joining the conversation, while with other people, you may be the one that starts the conversation. So when it comes to marketing a podcast, sure, we can talk about all the fancy tools and those kind of things. But I think at the end of the day, many people forget that it's really about the basics. And so many times people send me random emails, tweets, messages asking me to listen to their podcasts. And then the first thing I do is like, I look at what the podcast is all about, and I'm like, man, I'm not even your ideal listener. If you have a podcast that is tailored to working moms, for example, sorry, but I'm not a mom. So, I'm not really your ideal listener. So you may be better off spending that time or investing that time targeting working moms and not a dude like I am.
So, I mean, in today's age of personal branding and helping your business to stand out by putting yourself in the front of your business, then surely that, having a podcasting channel is one of the ultimate ways of doing that, because this often now is a differentiator between, certainly in a lot of service-based businesses, being ahead of your competition is whether you are willing to put yourself at the front of your business.
That's a very good point, Alex, that you make. And actually, sorry, I would add to what you said that it's putting yourself in front, but it's also putting yourself out there, because now you can't hide between text on your website or something like that. You're really out there. And even though your podcast may be pre-recorded, so you're not doing it live, you're still out there. So if you think your voice doesn't sound good, well, that's the voice you have. If you have a funny accent like I have, well, that's what you have. But I think for me personally, one inspirational thing I would add is all the things that I could have used as excuses for not getting started with podcasting, or all the quote unquote flaws, let's say, are actually turned out to be things that really draw people. For example, of all the guests I've interviewed, if I think about my podcasts and Virtual Summit combined, I've interviewed well over 300 people. I've interviewed Grammy Award-winning artists, New York Times bestselling authors, top entrepreneurs. I've interviewed people who would have had every right, if you want, to tell me, well, your accent is bothering, your English isn't perfect, blah, blah, blah. But I'm yet to meet somebody who really criticizes me for that. We actually laugh, and because I'm the first that makes a joke about it. As I said early on, I have this funny macaroni accent. So I think that even if a person says to themselves, well, I've never been in front of a microphone, or I've never done this, I've never done that, just remember that everybody starts from somewhere. And I would actually say, if you're interested in podcasting, but you think you aren't good enough, I would encourage you to pick your favorite podcast or podcasts, especially if you have a couple podcasts that have been, or podcasters that have been podcasting for a couple of years. Go and listen to their episode 1. If you don't have any, feel free to go to thejazzspotlight.com/episode 1. I'll double check, Alex. I'll send you the link to that as well, because it's the very first podcast recording I've ever done. So if now I sound comfortable in front of a mic and this and that, go and listen to that and you'll hear a big difference.
Yeah, we're all going to be a bit embarrassed with our first episodes. It's normal. So brilliant. So, and you covered this before, and I just want to go back to it again, because I had quite a few listeners that approached me and said to me, Alex, when are you going to start doing the video versions of your podcasts? So does it make sense to migrate from audio to video? And what are the pros and cons about that? Or is there a place for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think it depends. For example, it is just a subjective thing. And I'm a person, by the way, who uses YouTube a lot. I listen to a lot of playlists on YouTube or things like that. So I said, listen. So technically it's a video, but I'm doing other things, so I don't really watch it. For me, I personally I don't always see the value in doing what I would refer to as a basic interview, or like conversation, as you and I are having, as doing it in video form. I feel that the only thing that would add to the experience of somebody who tunes in is that they get to see us. But that's it. I feel that if it was an interview or a podcast, even if it's a solo show, where there is some visual elements. Perhaps there is a whiteboard or something like that, or we are in a very beautiful, I don't know, we have background, or we are recording at a rooftop bar with a fantastic view, then that's a different thing. But for me personally, I've done some videos for YouTube, but they haven't been the video version of the podcast. They've been more tutorials. So I don't know. For me, I'd found that when people say, well, should I just record the video and then strip the audio? For me, I'm like, well, if that's something you want to do, but when it goes to content consumption and retention, audience retention, audio is still more powerful than video, meaning people listen to audio for longer periods of times and more frequently, because as I said, one can consume audio pretty much 24/7. So I think it really depends from the person to person. Obviously, using video gives you the advantage that you can leverage the second most powerful search engine in the world, which is YouTube. And that is something that shouldn't be overlooked. But for me personally, if one wants to use YouTube, I would rather create YouTube specific videos, because that's also a thing that and I've done videos. So for my digital conference, I do video interviews. And when I do video, I feel that it's a different ball game. So for example, the way I look, I kind of has certain impact. The way I dress, the posture I have, the lighting I have, all those kind of things. So for me, I would personally, if somebody is listening to you and I, Alex, and wants to use video, I would be very deliberate about the video content. And I wouldn't just say, well, create video and just strip the audio and you have a video show and a podcast.
Very good advice. Really helpful. So taking a step back and more about your overall business, could you perhaps give us some insights into how you've structured your overall business to make it into this really sort of location independent business with global reach? Because there's something which I think a lot of people aspire to. And it's not just about the podcast, it's more than that. But perhaps give us just sort of 2 or 3 insights into how you run a business like that.
Yeah, and is it okay if while I do that, I also give some general advice for people who may be in a different... Okay.
Absolutely.
So for me, first of all, as I am a solopreneur, so I work by myself, I do have some people that I, let's say, collaborate with, meaning, for example, a company that does accounting for me and those kind of things. But mainly it's just me. And I think that when is somebody in that position, is very key to be organized and to be very specific about things. For example, in my case, most of the clients I have, my consulting clients, are based in North America, which means that I hardly have consulting calls in the morning or early afternoon, my time, which is great. So that means that on a logistical or organizational point of view, means that I know that I typically have time in the mornings and early afternoon to take care of other things. Think like recording podcasts or brainstorm new products or services or do clients work. So clients that I do work for. So no, we don't have a call. So I think doing something like that is very key. Understanding who you want to work with or who you're currently work with and how, where they are can help you structure your days. In some cases, that may not be the case. Maybe you work with people all over the world and you can't really identify a schedule like the one I have where it's pretty clear. But that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is key to have, and there's plenty of tools nowadays, but I think it's key to have a tool that is basically your online headquarters. And I typically refer to your own website as online headquarters, but in this case, I'm referring to project management tools. And I'm thinking of Trello, which is something I use, or tools like Airtable or Asana, because when you're by yourself, you're taking care of so many different things or are involved in quite many different projects. So you can't expect to be remembering every single detail of every single project. That's why tools like Trello or Airtable or Asana come in handy. And I love the fact that they also come in with apps, which means that you can also add things, edit things, remove things even if you're on the go. And that applies also to your clients as well. With many clients I work with, we use Trello. So we have basically a joint, they are called boards, but it's basically a joint portal, and we get to interact there. So in terms of the structuring, I think that it's also something that is important for people to keep in mind, that it may take some time before you find what is the right structure or the structure that feels good to you. I didn't start out with everything so well defined, also because there are certain things that I added on later. So then those kind of forced me to rethink a bit the way I carry out my work. So for example, I started doing client work with the podcast marketing side of things over the last 6 or 7 months. So that's something that then forced me to reorganize a bit my work schedule, because now that's something, those are work or tasks that have specific deadlines. So they don't depend only on me, but they also depend on the other person, the customer. When do they want this specific thing to be done by?
Very good advice. And I'll put some of those tools in the show notes afterwards so people can access them. They're very, very interesting. And I'll take a look at them myself. So just moving on then, and you mentioned a couple of your clients before, but I'm just wondering if there were any other client success stories that you'd like to talk about, or any learnings that you've got from working with your clients and helping them with their podcast that you think stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, in terms of client success stories, I'm always happy when I get emails or messages by clients who have really achieved goals they set up. And sometimes we set them up together, and sometimes after working with me, they set them up. I've had a couple of clients whose podcasts have passed, one I think passed the 2 million download mark, which is pretty nice. And it's actually a podcast that is really impactful because it covers anxiety. So I call it a serious podcast compared to mine. So that's nice. And that has been like
that's amazing,
very gratifying thing also for me on a personal level. And then some of my clients, or one client that I mentioned early on that went on the virtual book tour, she had been a podcast guest before working with me. But then when we worked together, we kind of sharpened her skills. And she said that the interview she did for Entrepreneur on Fire, which is a very popular business podcast, was probably the best she had ever done. So that was also nice, of course, for me, but also for her, because she got some good sales from that. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's always so that I would say, to kind of summarize, I would say that for me, the best success stories are always when somebody is able to do something they never thought they were able to do. And it doesn't matter whether that's starting a podcast or stepping on stage in front of hundreds or thousands of people as a speaker, and they got that, or that basically getting to that point started with them starting a podcast. In my case, I work mainly around podcasting. So podcasting, or the word podcast, is always there somewhere. For me, those are I would say, the most gratifying feelings on a personal level when I hear or see these kind of things about my customers. And you had asked me also another question. What was it again?
Well, it was related. It was either any additional learnings you wanted to pass.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Learning about working with customers. Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, you have to have patience. I love my clients, but you really have to have patience. And you also have to be diligent, but also understanding, because, unexpected things may happen. Let's say if somebody gets sick, it's not the one wakes up and decides, hey, today I want to get sick. And especially if it's a serious illness or something like that. So I think that it's important for you to be diligent, to be on time and everything, but also to be understanding if there is something that, that changes the plans. And also the final thing I would add related to that is, you also shouldn't be afraid to communicate with your customers. So if something goes wrong, let's say, and to me has happened, especially with info products, perhaps there is a problem with a video, or there's a problem with the site. I think it's always key to communicate with people, because at the end of the day, we are people. So if you communicate, you actually, sure, you show kind of your vulnerable side, but that takes you closer to the other human you're communicating with, because they're going to say, hey, no problem. I just wanted to let you know, and to me has happened several times that, to some degree or another, and you and I were even talking about this before we started, sometimes with technologies like that, there are issues for no particular reason, and sometimes it's enough to simply restart a computer or something like that.
Great. No, very, very good bits of advice there. Appreciate that. So let's look at the future then. For you, what's in store for you? What are you planning? What are your goals?
Yeah, so in terms of very near future, I'm actually about to head over to Philadelphia to present at Podcast Movement 2018. So I love what I do. I love working online, but of course it's always nice when you get to meet people in person. A few months ago, I presented at We Are Podcast in Australia. I always like when I get the chance to meet fans, listeners, clients, colleagues, or even interviewers or interviewees in person. And sometimes it's quite the interesting feeling when you have known somebody for 2, 3, 4 years, and then you finally get to meet in person. It's going to happen with Crystal and James, the 2 members of the mastermind I mentioned early on. We're going to meet in New York for the first time, and I've known the 2 of them, I think, for 4 years or something. So that's quite interesting. And then in terms of plans for the future, there is my membership site, the Podcast Success Academy, which has undergone a restyling. So that's going to be exciting because there's going to be some new things with that. And it's basically a sort of, I don't know if I would Netflix for podcasters. I'm not sure if that makes it really clear for people. But basically, once the restyling is done, is going to be a resource for people where they can really pick a different layer of podcasting that they're interested in and would like to learn more about and focus on that. And it's a series of video courses. There is some live trainings and things like that. So that's for the near future. And in terms of longer term plans, well, one that has been in the work that for quite some time, I have to admit, is to write a book also related to podcasting and do more speaking. I would say those are the main 2 things because, speaking, because of my geographical position, Helsinki, most of the speaking I do is outside of Helsinki. So it always means also moving quite a lot, relatively far. I mean, I mentioned Australia, I mentioned now Philadelphia, New York, and things like that. So I definitely want to do more and more speaking and, impact more people, because at the end of the day, with the work I do, with the content I create, my goal is to always impact people, in my case with podcasting, so that then they can leverage this great medium to share their message with the world and impact then more people themselves.
I always thought I'd never write a book, but I must admit now that in a way the book is almost writing itself. There's a lot of content, a lot of ideas, a lot of inspiration coming from the interviews that I do that I think that could be in the book in the future. So
nice.
It's another. I think it's also one of the other benefits, side benefits of having a show.
Yeah, for me it's actually the opposite because I'm not sure if I should be the one to say this, but I've always been relatively good at writing. Meaning, even when I did my bachelor, which was in Italian, I asked if I could write my thesis in English. My master's was in English. I worked as a journalist writing in English. So the writing part isn't really a problem for me. It's more about really finding the time to actually go from A to Z. Because for me, it's like going from A to B to C. It's never been a problem with this book, but then there's more things that pop up and that kind of is put aside. And it's a pity because I really see the potential in something like that. But hey, hopefully by, actually, I'm not going to say any date, but hopefully very soon there's actually going to be a book and I can add the tag author to my bio.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, listen, Yann, we're going to wrap up now. I really appreciate having you on. But before we go, I just wanted to ask you, what's the best way for people to find you online, to experience some of what you offer today? What would be the place that you'd like them to go and visit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. Well, my own website is yannilunga.com. I know you're going to have a link in the show notes. And I'm all over social media. But I would say the best way, especially after the conversation we have been having here, is to go to yannilunga.com/community. So that's YANNILUNGA.com/community. And that will take you to the Podcast Growth Mastermind, which is a free Facebook group you can join. And it's all about podcasting. And we have, I think, at the time of this recording, over 2,400 people from all over the world at different stages of their podcasting journey. We have podcast fans, we have new podcasters, people who have been podcasting for a year, people who have been podcasting for several years, members of the podcasting industry, so people or companies that develop apps and other things like that. So if you're interested in podcasting at any level, whether it's being a host, being a guest, whatever, yannilunga.com/community is the way to go. And that's also the perfect way to get in touch with me because I'm there pretty much every day. And I know, Alex, you are there as well.
I'm there as well, indeed. Hopefully we'll see some of you on the inside in there.
Awesome. And if you do, please make sure to tag myself and tag Alex so that we know that you're there in the group and you came after listening to this great interview. And Alex, I want to say thank you, by the way, again for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Yann. And I want to thank you for everything that you've done today. I want to thank you for all the people that you help as well, and all the great work you do for them. Recognize that, and let's do this again in the future sometime. Really appreciate having you.
Absolutely, I would love it. Grazie ancora.
Grazie, thank you, and bye bye.